Good afternoon, and welcome to this session to help people in the early stages of their career understand what QUFA is proposing in terms of conversion to a new pension plan. So my name is Leslie German. I'm the Executive Director at QUFA, and with me is Professor Rob Hickey, who helped to negotiate the agreements we're going to talk to you about today. We've got mostly, I think, people online. It's a pretty snowy, blowy day here in Kingston, so if you are at home, you can send in live questions, and we're perfectly happy to answer them. What we're going to do is a very brief background to why we're asking you to vote in a ratification vote coming up in a week or so on two different issues. And then Professor Hickey is going to give us much more interesting and detailed information on comparing the pension plans, what we're asking you to think about in terms of the UPP or the new pension plan. And we'll talk a bit about the ratification process to be sure that you understand it. And then we're open for questions. And any questions are just fine. So I'm going to get started with a little bit of a background, a little bit of history. So in 2011, just before I came to QUFA, actually, possibly before many of you came to QUFA, the round of bargaining was pretty tough going. It came very close to a strike lockout position. And one of the issues that was at stake then was that the administration was asking QUFA members to agree to some concessions around the pension, specifically to increase their contribution rates and also to change part of the funding formula. And QUFA, of course, didn't want to do this, but it was quite clear in the fact that we got so close to strike lockout that the administration wasn't taking no for an answer. QUFA members gave QUFA, the union, a strong strike mandate, which is what allowed QUFA to keep the concessions to a minimum. Nonetheless, there were concessions. And I make this point because it really sets up the context for what ensues following that round of bargaining. So then in 2012, the Ontario government imposed what are known as solvency payments on universities with private pension plans. Solvency payments or the solvency deficit, covering off your solvency deficit, means that you have enough money in the plan that if you wind up business tomorrow and have to pay out all your existing liabilities, there's enough money to do it. The solvency requirement is usually only for single employer plans, and it's there so that situations like Sears and Nortel can't happen, where a company closes its doors and the people with all their money in a pension plan get nothing. It's kind of odd to apply it to a semi-public sector institution because the chances of Queen's winding up tomorrow are pretty slim. But nonetheless, the Ontario government and both the Liberals and Conservatives have supported this, have applied these payments, these penalties. They were held in abeyance for a number of years, but we have started to have to make the solvency payments. And so there's a 6% tax on units right now to cover off these solvency payments. So it's a real fact on campus around the pension. In any case, because of this pressure, and it puts a great deal of pressure on operating budgets, one of our Confederation associations, so this is QUFA, the Ontario Confederation of University Faculty Associations, and COU, which is the Council of Ontario Universities, that's the employer side to QUFA, approached the Ministry of Training Colleges and Universities with the plan to design a sector-wide pension plan for the university sector. And one of the primary impetuses for doing that is that if you have a jointly sponsored multi-employer plan, you no longer have to pay solvency into a solvency account. You don't have to have insurance for wind up tomorrow. And the reason's obvious. A multi-employer plan, very unlikely all the employers are going to wind up together, and so the plan doesn't need this special insurance. So that went ahead, and QUFA and Queen's were at the table from the outset to start to look at this new plan. And one of the reasons Queen's and QUFA, but particularly QUFA, sat to the table, and we've been there since 2014, we're still there in some senses today, is because if this were going to go forward, if a new plan was going to be designed, we thought it was very important to have your interests represented in those negotiations. So the QPP, or the Queen's Pension Plan, is a bit of an oddball, and I'm not going to steal Rob's thunder, but it is a bit of a strange beast, and it has features in it that we thought if we're not at the table, we're not going to be able to do our jobs to make sure your interests are defended. So we went to the table. And in 2015, 2015, we were in the middle of these negotiations of a new plan, and bargaining went much better. And one of the things we agreed in 2015 is that if this new plan comes into fruition, so not necessarily into being, but there's an agreement to form it that looks good, and that process ends near to the signing of a new collective agreement or negotiation of a new collective agreement in 2019, we agreed that we would tie the negotiations of these two things together. We would tie our consent to join a new pension with negotiating a new collective agreement. And so that's what we've done. And I'm going to skip 2 slides and go back 1. So what that has created was a situation in which we were told in September of 2018 that the timeline for QUFA to give its consent to convert the pension was that we had to have that decision by February of 2019. As you may know, the current collective agreement expires in April of 2019. So you see the 6-month deadline coincided. And so we said to ourselves in the fall, all right, so now we've got to get to the table and bargain the 2 things at the same time. What can we bring our members if we agree to consent to convert the pension? And what can we bring our members in terms of a new collective agreement? And so in November of 2018, QUFA sat down, we gathered together a bargaining team very quickly, sat down and did a lightning round of bargaining in which we really focused on these 2 questions. What will the administration give our members to entice them to say yes to an alternate pension plan? And what can we get while we have this bargaining power for them in terms of a new collective agreement? So in a moment, we'll explore both of the answers to both of those in more detail. And so in December of 2018, after only 6 meetings, we did get both agreements signed up. And that's what we're bringing to you for ratification in February 9th to 15th. But before I pass it to Rob, I want to spend just a moment on this slide because I know there's a lot of concern out there. Well, if why has QUFA been involved all the way along? Well, a couple of things. First of all, I think most boldly, we think the UPP is a better pension plan for most people. So just to state it outright, it's a good plan. We've done some good work at the negotiating table to make sure it provides a good, solid, guaranteed pension to our members. We also feel that the solvency payment threat, and now reality, has an immediate effect on the working conditions of our members. So money not going into running departments and hiring new people and having TA support and fixing infrastructure is money not going into improving your working conditions. So in signing on to the UPP, we're hopeful that the solvency payments will be relaxed and that money can go back into improving your working conditions. As I acknowledged with the 2011 situation, our power to block change with regard to the pension is extremely limited. So we've heard over the course of these few months that members will make the argument, but QUFA has a veto on changes to the pension. Well, it does. Until the collective agreement is open, which it will be May 2019 if this ratification doesn't pass, and they decide they want changes and simply stall until we are forced to either strike or we get locked out, and until our members tell us, take the changes, just get us back to work. So our ability to block change is very limited. It's not as strong as it appears with the words like veto. As well, there's a going concern deficit in the plan, and that changes with market returns. It is bigger or smaller depending on how the market is doing. But the going concern deficit is the deficit in having enough in your plan to literally keep paying your going concern, your ongoing liabilities. So there is a deficit in the QPP, and that's an intergenerational debt transfer. We want to start with a new plan that will start with no deficits. Queens will have to amortize what it owes on this deficit and pay it out. The UPP will start with no deficits, and there'll be no debt transfer to future generations. So it's kind of a chance to start clean, and we think that's a good thing to do. A JSPP model is far more stable than a single employer plan. And it also allows we, the employees, to have a say in how it's governed. So we also think that's a good thing. That introduces a level of small c conservative and stability to the running of a pension plan, which isn't necessarily there if the administration runs the plan by itself. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to say very clearly, QUFA is asking you to vote yes on the ratification vote. And Rob's going to tell you a little bit more about the plans, which will probably open up questions.
Thanks, Leslie. And since we're a small group today, feel free to wave your hands and stop me if you have questions that come up. As Leslie said, I'm going to do a more detailed overview of what's in the proposed university pension plan. But let me first start by talking a little bit about, well, what do we currently have in our Queen's plan? Now, most of you would have received recently your pension statement. And if you haven't cracked this open or opened the envelope and taken a look, I encourage you to do so, because the Queen's plan can be a little confusing. Most pension plans are either what we call a defined contribution or a defined benefit plan, and I'll explain what those are in a moment. Queen's is both. So when you look at your pension statement and it has your normal retirement date, you'll see two lines. You'll see the top line that says money purchase benefits, or money purchase pension, and the next one that says minimum guarantee pension. And that's what it means to be a hybrid plan. We have both an option for going out like a defined contribution plan or a money purchase plan, or we also have kind of a safety net for what is the minimum guarantee, and that's like a defined benefit plan. And depending upon your earnings, depending upon your years of service, and most importantly, depending upon market performance, your money purchase plan can be better than your minimum guarantee. And I want to emphasize that it really depends upon market performance, because that's at the base what defined contribution plans really entail. Is there's contributions going into the plan, but for the individual employee, at the end of the day, their retirement is dependent upon market performance. Defined benefit plans, and this is one reason why employers in the private sector and more generally have tried to move away from them, individual employees don't bear the risk of market performance. Your defined benefit is established by kind of three factors. First, what we call the accrual rate, which is, I'll show you what it is in the Queen's plan in a moment, but it's the essentially the proportion of your earnings that go towards your pension benefit, your years of service, and your final average salary. So in some ways, you can already predict today what your pension will be 20 years from now. Whereas with a money purchase or with as the defined contribution plan, you're making assumptions as to, well, will the market continue to expand? Will we experience another significant recession? So just as an example, our colleagues who retired in 2008, 2009, nearly all of them went out on the minimum guarantee pension. Why? Well, because the market tanked and their money purchase, their individual pots of money within the pension plan lost tremendous value. But because of the hybrid nature, because of the defined benefit nature of the Queen's plan with the minimum guarantee, they still had a pension to rely upon. As I mentioned, most employers in the private sector have moved away from defined benefits, but when we came together to try and craft a university pension plan, that was one thing that certainly all the employee groups agreed with, and the employers didn't really fight that, is the defining characteristic of this plan needs to be defined benefit. And for us at Queen's, that's one of the biggest changes is in terms of assessing what we have now versus what's in the university pension plan, is we're going from a plan that's hybrid, that's a little bit different, to a plan that's a bit more established at other universities. So the University of Toronto and the University of Guelph, the two partner universities involved in this project, are both going from defined benefit to defined benefit. We're going from hybrid to defined benefit. Leslie already explained the important change in the governance. So the Queen's pension plan, as she stated, it's bargained. We have the right to bargain over changes, but ultimately it's managed and administered by the Board of Trustees and by Queen's administration. So in terms of who the investment managers are, what are the investment policies, what are the mechanisms for holding investment managers accountable, all of that rests solely and exclusively in the plan sponsor with the employer. In a jointly sponsored pension plan, employees and the administration sit together on the sponsor board. So the administration and the accountability and ultimately oversight of investment policy and investment management is held by employees and administrators. And so the way it would work with the UPP, there would be 6 employer sponsors and 6 employee sponsors. And within those 6 employee sponsors, 3 faculty associations would sit on the board, and then 3 employee groups like the steelworkers. And so if the plan starts as proposed, the Queen's University Faculty Association would have 1 seat on the sponsor board. So, for the first time, Queen's employees would have a more direct voice in the administration. And it's important for a couple of reasons. One reason is that no changes can be made to the plan design without the agreement of both the employees and the employer on that sponsor board. So it kind of removes the, tough bargaining in terms of threats of strikes or lockouts to protect our pension benefits, and it forces the 2 parties to work on a consensus basis. They can't strike or force us, lock us out, because that has to be worked out collaboratively through the sponsor board. The other advantage for us, and this has happened in the past, although we don't tend to talk about it in the current context of unfunded liabilities, is that at times pension funds, depending upon market performance, reach full funding or even overfunding. And in the past, when that has happened, single employers have opted to take what they call a pension contribution holiday. Now, the alternate response to being overfunded is rather than stop paying to pay out extra benefits. And in jointly sponsored plans, that tends to be the response in terms of managing over-contributions rather than stopping payment to enhance benefits if the plan performance warrants it. So those are the 2 top lines in this slide, moving from a hybrid plan to a defined benefit, the single employer having authority over the plan to a jointly sponsored plan. The other thing I should mention before I get into the specific numbers is that under the proposal, everything that you've earned at Queen's you continue to keep. And the way that having a new plan after inception is that you would begin to accrue the benefits of this new plan after that inception date. So anything that you earn at Queen's you keep, and you continue to have those benefits, and those benefits will be paid as it's spelled out in your Queen's pension statement. And another way of thinking about it is, let's say I retire 20 years from now. I have 15 years at Queen's, 15 years in the UPP. My pension would be calculated half based upon my Queen's pension and half based upon the UPP. Now, for early stage folks, we're hoping that probably much more than half of your pension will be calculated under this new formula. So what does the new formula have? Well, in the left column in the QPP, you see what I referred to as the accrual rates. And you see 2 numbers there because in most pension plans, they integrate with the Canada Pension Plan, so the CPP. Now, this is the odd reason, if you've been here for more than a year, why your pay often suddenly goes up in July or August. It seems like, wow, what just happened? Well, you stopped making contributions to the CPP because you've reached the yearly maximum pensionable earnings for the CPP. So in 2019, that's $57,400. And so your accrual rate for earnings that are in line with the CPP are lower. Your earnings that are above the CPP rate, your accrual rate is higher because it's not supplemented by the CPP. So when you retire, you'll get your CPP plus the Queen's pension or whichever other pension. And the way that most pension plans, particularly those for higher salary occupations, you'll have that dual rate, 1.4% and 1.8%. And that's what the minimum guarantee provides. And when you look at your pension statement, your minimum guarantee is pretty well set, again, because it's set by your years of service, your average salary, and by these accrual rates. Your money purchase is an estimate based upon what the calculator says will be the likely average returns over that time. And of course, those estimates could be bang on or they could be wildly off, and it could fluctuate depending upon the year that you retire. For the UPP, those accrual rates go up, meaning there's a higher benefit under the UPP plan design. They increase to 1.6 and 2.0. Now, it doesn't seem like much, but it's actually about a 12.5% enhancement over the current minimum guarantee. And I mention that for a couple of reasons. First, one of the challenges that we had in terms of looking at the plan design and thinking about the shift from a hybrid plan to the UPP was, well, for faculty who retire, whose pension is more robust through the money purchase, how much value is there in the money purchase over and above the minimum guarantee? And again, you can kind of look for yourself on your pension statement to see, okay, my normal retirement date, here's my money purchase estimate, here's my minimum guarantee estimate. For me, it's not quite 10%, but it's almost 10%, and on average for most faculty, if you retire in the right year, meaning you're not retiring during a major recession event, and you go out on your money purchase, on average for faculty, it's about a 10% value enhancement to the minimum guarantee. So the UPP plan design meets or slightly exceeds what we think is the best estimate in terms of an apple to orange comparison between a hybrid plan and a defined benefit plan. Now, those enhanced benefits do carry costs. So yes, we're doing better, equal or a little bit better, but we're going to be paying more. And I'll explain why that is, but let's first look to see, well, how much is that? So currently under the QPP, and again, these two rates are depending upon earnings below the CPP yearly maximum pensionable earnings and those above. So you pay 7% of your salary or 7% contributions of your salary up to that $57,400, and then 9% for earnings above that. That goes up to 9.2% and 11.5%. And in practical terms, that's about a 2.4% hit on your salary. So your contributions increase by about 2.4% of your salary. And I'll come back to that in a moment when I talk about what we sought for offsets. Now, part of the model of a JSPP is that it's 50-50. The costs are 50%, the risks are 50%, the administration, the management is 50%. So currently, Queens does not pay the same amount that we do into our pension plan. That's a little bit deceptive, but I'll come back to that in a moment. Their current contribution rates to our pension benefits are 6% below the yearly maximum pensionable earnings and 7.5% above. Now, I said it's a little deceptive because if I was going to put on my employer hat, I would immediately say, you union folks are forgetting that we're making all these special solvency payments, and that's correct. So their real contributions are much higher because of the obligation for those special solvency payments. But from an employee perspective, in terms of what is our compensation, this is our compensation, the 6% and 7.5%. That goes up to meet what our contributions will be, 9.2 and 11.5. So overall, that is an increase to our direct compensation in terms of matching employer contributions. Now, the next line is perhaps most relevant to any of you with birthdays in July or August. Because the Queen's plan for academic staff, and you can kind of understand the historical nature of this, you reach normal retirement date on July 1st after your 65th birthday. So for me as a Pisces in March, it's not that big of a deal. If I was, is it Cancer? Leo? If I was born in July or August, it could be I'm almost 66 before I reach my normal retirement date. Under the UPP, you reach normal retirement date the last day of the month in which you turn 65. And that's important because, well, why would you have to work an extra year compared to somebody else? Now, obviously, it doesn't change our kind of professional obligation to be thoughtful and, I'm not going to show up in class in early October and say, see you later, I'm gone at the end of the month. But it does provide, I think, more flexibility. And that is one feature that we have in our consent agreement to bring into the Queen's plan to align it with this normal retirement date function. Now, the other thing that the UPP had that is attractive to a lot of staff is what they call the Factor 80. And you may have heard different things about this, but simply put, it means that if you are age 60 and you have at least 20 years of service, you're able to retire with an unreduced pension, early unreduced pension. And again, if you look at your pension statement, it gives you an estimate for what your pension will be when you're age 60. And for most, the minimum guarantee is going to be a little bit better than the money purchase, but the minimum guarantee already assumes the early retirement penalty in that calculation. So at Queen's, for each year that you retire before your normal retirement date, so age 65 or almost 66 if you're a Leo, you're basically losing 10% of your pension if you retire at 60. So it's 2% a year. Under the UPP model, you wouldn't be impacted by that special charge or that special fee for early retirement. Now, it doesn't mean that you'll get the same pension at 60 as you would at 65. Why? Because one of the three variables or factors for determining your pension is years of service. So you're not going to have as many years of service when you're 60 as if you would have worked 5 more years to your 65. So it doesn't incur the penalty, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be the same pension. The last thing to mention on this top line, and then I'll talk about the other two changes, is the Queen's Plan has a somewhat unique formula for indexation. And when we talk about indexation, what it means is what are the methods for protecting your pension against the loss of value through inflation? So you retire, you're retired hopefully for a couple of decades at least, and your pension will lose value against inflation if there isn't some mechanism to try and track inflation or to index your pension over time. And what the Queen's Plan provides is that your pension is indexed based upon the market performance of the Queen's Pension Plan investment funds. So if Queen's investments in that year have returns above 6%, then your pension will be indexed and increased along with the returns that are above 6%. Now, in some years, that's great. In fact, in the last few years, I'm not talking about the market performance in the last quarter, but over the last 4 or 5 years, our retired colleagues have done very well, and their pensions have been indexed 3%, 4%, or even higher in some years. Now, for our colleagues and the faculty member who I replaced back in 2006, when he retired at that time, and then the market tanked, his experience has been quite different because of this Queen's formula. So your pension is not reduced if the fund kind of tanks with a major recession event. But for all of our colleagues retiring in that time frame, this indexation formula means that the returns have to kind of make up all of that lost ground before they begin to experience indexation again. So at the annual pension meeting this past December, they again looked at that cohort, and they still have not received an indexation since 2008. So they've gone for an entire decade without any increase to their pension. So their pensions have lost real value in the face of inflation. Now, some would say, well, you were artificially high when you went out, and then the market correction reestablished where you should have been. Regardless, what it shows us is that the Queen's pension formula has winners and losers depending upon when you retire and how the market performs. So it tends to have risk assigned on an individual basis based upon time of retirement. And what most pension plans provide, the mechanism or formula that most pension plans use, is in line with what's proposed in the university pension plan. So it's based upon the consumer price index. And so what the indexation formula would be is 75% of CPI. Now, critics would say, well, that's guaranteed to lose value. You're only recouping 75% of the inflationary pressure on your value of your pension. But if we think about averaging out the experience of those who have gone for a decade without a pension versus those who have experienced good returns over the last few years, if that was averaged out over the entire pool of retirees in the Queen's Plan, it would be about 75% of CPI. So this model under the UPP and the model that most pension plans have do not have the higher end returns if you have some really spectacular market performances, but they also don't have the flat line as some plans have with that conditional on investment returns. It provides a more predictable, stable indexation over time. So those are the main features. And again, just to emphasize for early career colleagues, the defined benefit model is something that has been disappearing in most Canadian workplaces, certainly in the private sector, but pressures in the public sector. Why? Because our pension promises are guaranteed and protected. We know what our pension will be based upon our accrual rate, our years of service, and our average salary. The reason why most employers, certainly in the private sector and public managers, will push for a defined contribution plan is because it removes the risk from the organization, from the employer, and assigns that risk to individual employees. And for some, it may work out really well if you're a savvy investor and you retire at the right time in the business cycle. But for most people, defined benefit plans provide much more stable, predictable, and sustainable retirement income benefits. Now, there were a couple of features in the plan design that QUFA adamantly opposed, but like in any bargaining environment, you are able to get what you negotiate, not what you want. Throughout this process, I say we, myself and my colleague Paul Young, serving on the QUFA Pension Committee, in the plan design negotiation process over the last 4 years in Toronto, we repeatedly raised the issue that Queen's has a somewhat unique artifact of the end of mandatory retirement. So back in the mid-2000s, a charter case, a claim under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, was raised over the discriminatory effects of mandatory retirement regimes, meaning why should someone at age 65 be forced to retire? It's a prima facie case of age discrimination, and that case was successful, and we suddenly saw all organizations dropping mandatory retirement, at least most organizations. Some occupations it's still allowed. But what happened was you ended mandatory retirement, but you didn't change pension policy or pension procedures. So previous to that, when you hit 65, you retired, your pension activated. Currently, you hit 65, you can still activate your pension and continue to work. Now, there's one feature in the Canada Revenue Agency policies that also changed, and I can't remember what year this change came into effect, but the one thing that really makes this advantageous to some of our colleagues is what they call pension income splitting. Pension income splitting is the opportunity, if you have a spouse who had no earnings or low earnings, to assign your pension income to him or her, or at least a portion of your pension income. Why is that important? Well, because your marginal tax rates go up substantially if you're taking your salary plus your pension. So you could go up from a 45 or 48% tax rate up to a 53% tax rate. So you end up paying a larger chunk of that combined salary and pension to CRA, and having pension income splitting creates an advantage for some. Now, as you might expect, it also has a very gendered effect, and we see that effect amongst our colleagues here. So there are a number of colleagues who are currently between the age of 65 and 71 working and collecting their pension. Out of the 15 who do so, 13 are men and 2 are women, right? So there's a gendered effect. But more importantly than that, the other thing that most of our colleagues realize is that that's not necessarily the right choice in terms of maximizing the value of our pension benefits. When I talk about maximizing the value of our pension benefits, it could be more advantageous, and in fact, 75% of our colleagues between the age of 65 and 71 choose to continue to accrue pension credit during those years rather than activate their pension. Why? Well, you can do the calculations yourself. If you go to the Queen's Pension Plan, they have this nifty self-service pension calculator. I did it for myself. I looked at, well, what my pension will be at 65, and then I said, well, using those same assumptions, what is my pension when I'm 68? If I continue to make contributions between 65 and 68, my pension actually goes up by 20%. So the returns on those 3 years of additional pension credit are quite substantial, and of course, those returns, those benefits are for the rest of my life and for the life of my spouse as well. So 75% of our colleagues within that zone of 65 to 71 continue to work, but rather than collecting pension, they continue to accrue pension credits and will retire with a higher pension as a result. The other item to note is commuted value. And what commuted value means or refers to, and this is another somewhat unique or unusual option that Queen's has, and historically, this is one of the advantages of having your own boutique pension plan, is when you go to retire, you can walk into the Queen's Pension Office and they'll say, okay, you can buy better benefits. You can get a 15-year guarantee pension to go to your estate if you die before 15 years. You can have, by law, you have to have 60% joint spousal, but you could increase that to 80% or 100%. You have a lot of options when you retire, and you'll have many options under the UPP. But one option that we lose is the right to go in and say, well, how much money is in the pot for my pension? So rather than taking a monthly pension for the rest of my life, I just want to get a big check and walk out of the office. Now, it's not financial advice that I'd provide to most people, but for some people it's attractive, whether they have other plans for what to do with their commuted value and their pension, whether they are more sophisticated investment folks. For whatever reason, taking your commuted value has been an option within the Queen's plan. And that phases out. And for those of you in early careers, it'll likely phase out before you reach your normal retirement age. There's a 10-year phase-out period. So by the time, if the plan starts in 2021 as planned, by 2031, you could no longer take the commuted value after your age 55. If you leave Queen's before you're 55, you can take the commuted value. A lot of pension plans allow you to do that. It doesn't tend to be the right choice in terms of maximizing your value. You should leave your pension monies there and defer it and just wait for your normal retirement date and get another check from that institution. But ending commuted value is one of the features that we objected to, but we weren't able to achieve. The same with taking your pension while working. Like I said, we argue to retain that. Our colleagues at Toronto and Guelph, those faculty associations, of course, don't have that tradition in their institutions, so they weren't particularly sympathetic. But the strongest block to that was the government saying in no uncertain terms that it will not allow or support the creation of the UPP if it has this particular feature of what they call double dipping. You might recall a few years back when the teachers' pension plan came under attack because you had all these newly minted teachers coming out of teachers' colleges and they couldn't get jobs, and they looked around and they saw, well, you have all these folks collecting a pension from the teachers' plan and working in the classroom. So it's much more of a political issue than a plan design issue. But it wasn't one that we could overcome, and it's not one that we were able to change in the bargaining process. Any questions over plan design? So as I've demonstrated, there are costs and benefits, cost increases and benefit enhancements, and I'm going to talk about what are the offsets that we sought for those cost increases. But it looks like we have at least one question. And if you could go to the mic, since we're we're live streaming this.
I just want to double check if this is this a complete list of changes?
On the QUFA website, these are the ones that are most substantial in terms of benefits and costs. There is, I think, about a 15-page list
Well,
of more detailed descriptions of the UPP plan design. These are the essential ones.
these are but I can't, okay. And the other ones are not as significant as these? Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so they would include,
They dive into details, but the form is there for you. It's called Summary of Plan Changes.
Yeah.
If you go on the pension page, background documents, Summary of Plan Changes. It's a side-by-side, detailed, legalistic analysis. So it's all there for you, and you can decide if we've got the most salient ones. These are the terms of a pension that most people care most about, which is why we're highlighting them.
Okay, but can you give me just a rough indication of what these other changes are, what type? No?
no, I mean, these are, if I'm thinking about a pension, these are the ones that I immediately think about. The other ones rarely enter my
All right, then I will check it out. Thank you.
Please do.
So we had a question from a member online. So the question reads, if we are currently hitting the maximum yearly contribution of $26,000, will our employee contribution go up or down? On the slide, it says the employee contribution goes from 7 and 9%, both under and over YMPE, to 9.2 and 11.5%. However, the ratio of employee contribution to employer contribution goes down from 54 to 50%. Thanks for your help.
So it sounded like there was at least one question in there in terms of if you meet your yearly maximum pension contribution. So salaries also have a maximum. I think it's 168,000 under this formula in terms of you wouldn't be paying any pension contributions for salaries above that. It does change the room for RRSPs. So if you're making more contributions, pre-tax contributions to a pension, it will reduce the space for RRSP contributions. So if I'm understanding the question correctly, it doesn't create more space for RRSPs. It may constrain space for RRSP additional voluntary contributions. Any other questions? So let me talk a little bit about offset. So as I mentioned, there are increased costs associated with the proposed university pension plan, and we negotiated offsets. The harmonization I've already mentioned, and this proposal by the employer was something that, quite frankly, surprised us in bargaining. We went in with the assumption that we couldn't get early unreduced retirement because we asked for it in Toronto during that larger table of plan design negotiations. But when we started bargaining here, the employer put early unreduced retirement to current QPP plan members on the table. And what this means is that early unreduced retirement is one of the most costly aspects of most pension plans. You can think about it in terms of, well, you get charged 2% of your pension for each year before 65 that you go out. And your current payments for those plans that have early unreduced retirements, you're paying for those benefits. At Queen's, we haven't had any early unreduced retirement formula or benefits, in part because we haven't been paying for it. So what Queen's is essentially doing is they're saying, we will retroactively credit that past service to be eligible for this early unreduced retirement. What this essentially means is that your Queen's service will be treated just as the UPP service to combine for that 60 factor 80. So if you have 10 years at Queen's and 20 years in the UPP, you'll have the same formula for age 60, 20 years of service, factor 80. Without this, we would be in the odd situation of having early unreduced retirement for your new benefits under the UPP, but not having early unreduced retirements for your benefits accrued under the Queen's pension plan. So what this creates And I do want to emphasize it was surprising because it is a costly move by the employer to extend early unreduced retirement to past QPP service. Now, it wasn't something that we asked for, though. In that odd moment after they presented, we had to think quickly and say, thanks, we'll take that, but we still want what we asked for. And what we asked for were two primary monetary offsets. The first one is related to the increase in contribution rates. So as I mentioned, it's about a 2.4% hit on your salary in terms of the increase of 7% to 9.2 and 9% to 11.5. And we agreed to a 1.5% offset to pensionable salary. So it's not 100%, but it's about a 2/3 offset to that increased cost. Now, when Leslie talks about the regular annual across-the-board increases, you'll see that the combination of this one-time salary boost plus the across-the-board increase means in the year in which you would pay higher contributions, you'll see a 1% increase to your salary rather than a 3.4% increase. The other item that we targeted, and this was in part because of the loss of being able to activate pension, is to introduce a voluntary phased retirement program at Queen's. Queen's is unusual in that it has kind of no rational exit strategy for faculty to leave academe in a kind of dignified, planned manner. And we thought that introducing a phased retirement program would bring some order as well as some enhancements, inducements for our colleagues at the end of their time at Queen's. And when we looked at various models, we identified the University of Toronto model as an attractive, a well-designed model. When we talked to our faculty colleagues there, they've had great experiences with it, and these are the main features of that phased retirement program. So it's a 3-year program, and it's irrevocable. So when you get ready to retire, so you can start it at age 62, you have to start it by your 68 because you have to be retired by the end of the 3 years. You basically say, over the next 3 years, I want to reduce and phase out my responsibilities. And if we think about your responsibilities, in each of those 3 years, we can think about it as kind of 100% each year. So you have 300% of responsibilities over 3 years. Under the phased program, you would reduce those to a level of between 150% and 200%. So you could cut your responsibilities in half each year and do 50-50-50. You could do 75-75-50, but you have to fall within that 150 to 200 band. Now, the one thing I should say about that is that the reduction has to happen across all your responsibilities. You can't cut out your teaching and keep all the rest. So that was one concession we made to the employer. But the attractive feature of that, because you reduce your responsibilities, your salary is prorated, but recall how I said how much your pension goes up at the end of your career because your salary is likely to be at the highest level there. Rather than basing your pension credits on those reduced responsibilities, you continue to earn 100% pension credit for each year of those 3 years. So maybe you're working at 50%, but you're still getting 100% pension contributions. So you're not losing any value of that key 3-year window period at the end of your career. And that's one key aspect to that. The other aspect, and again, this is based upon the Toronto model, is that you get paid a 75% salary bonus. So you're reducing your salary, in line with the reduction of responsibilities between 100% and 200% out of 300%, but you can recoup 75% of an annual salary. And that can be paid out, 25% each year to make up some of the difference, or you can take it as a lump sum payment at the end of 3 years as a retirement allowance. And we have those two different ways of doing it because there are tax advantages of taking it as a retirement allowance once you exit the workforce. So that's the model. And again, it's irrevocable. Once you start it, you can't a year in say, hey, I want to keep going, right? It provides the administration with a tool for planning and hopefully a tool for faculty renewal. The last couple of items I don't get into as much. This one is more technical than substantive in terms of the bargaining process. Historically, the pension issue has been the one issue that Queen's faculty members cared most about. And so if we're kind of taking that off the table, we had a concern that, that the administration, if they wanted to play hardball during some round of bargaining, and we no longer had the pension issue to rally our troops with, that could be bad for us because our current expiry date is in April, so they could put us into a lockout position on July 1st, and it could just have bad outcomes. So what this entails as part of the consent package is if we agree to go to this pension and pension is kind of no longer on the table, the expiry moves to June 30th. So if the administration at some point down the road chooses to take a more aggressive approach to their treatment of faculty in bargaining, they wouldn't get us into a lockout position until September 1st. So they would have to think much more carefully about an aggressive bargaining stance in that model. So that's the last item for the offsets. Any questions about offsets? Micheline.
Okay, so this is just a follow-up to the previous question. So it reads, sorry for the confusion, my question was not answered. The specific question was how much would the employee contribution be under the new plan if your salary is above the $168,000? Right now, my annual contribution is $14,000, which is 54% of the $26,000 of the annual contribution. Under the new plan, what would the employee contribution be?
Right. So it's going to be higher. So depending upon your salary, you would take 9.2% of your salary below $57,000, and that number moves each year in terms of the CPP yearly maximum pensionable earnings. So you can calculate that portion, and then you take the portion of your salary above that to wherever your salary max is, multiply that by 11.5%, and that will give you your annual employee contribution. And you're right that the employer contribution also goes up, and so it'll match the employee contribution. So that would be the mechanism for calculating your contribution, and it's going to depend on each individual's salary mass.
Thank you.
Hopefully I hope that answered your question. If it didn't, email me and I'll try again. At this point, let me turn it back over to Leslie, because what we did in bargaining is we were bargaining over changes to the pension plan, but it coincided with the renewal of our collective agreement. So this is a combined consent to convert the pension as well as to renew the collective agreement. And we didn't do a lot of kind of long language negotiation, but we did have some important monetary issues, and I'll turn that back over to Leslie.
Okay, so what we've got on our slide is just really very much the monetary issues that we negotiated, but I will explain what we did with substantive or language issues. So the first thing is we did across the board increases of 1.6, 1.6, and 1.9%. These are monies that go to base. It's not one-time only payments. It goes to base salary, and it goes to anything that is affected by the ATB. So that could be stipends for term adjuncts. It's obviously salary rates. It's also professional expense reimbursements. So it's anything that is typically affected by the ATB or the across the board is going to go up by these amounts. And this is a nice comparable number. This is pretty much roughly comparable to what Western just negotiated. And we negotiated this before the announcement of the 10% tuition cut that Ford just made. So we're hoping to lock these in. It's not clear if we have to go back to scratch and bargain from zero if we're going to get numbers this good again. We also maintained what's called the anomaly side table. So this is just a little fund that triggers the parties, particularly the administration, to run some calculations on people's individual salaries and to look for what are known as anomalies, or where somebody who with the similar years of experience and in a similar discipline seems to sort of have a lower salary that's inexplicable. Then you have the fund. The fund is available to top up that salary, to bring it back into a statistical normal range. If you don't have money in this account, you don't run the calculations. And that means if you go for too many years without running these calculations, people can, and largely it's women, but it's not only women, people can fall off the graph. Like because of lower starting salaries or other issues, they can slowly find themselves very anomalous. So we want to have a bit of money in there to make sure that we're running the calculations. And then the one thing that we got, I always call it our one pink pony, like the one thing we added to this collective agreement that was novel, that had nothing to do with offsets or anything else, was we got a little bit of a foot in the door piece of language that says if a continuing adjunct is promoted to associate from assistant professor, that means they've essentially passed the tenure bar, and then they get any kind of external funding, so any kind, not Tri-Council necessarily, but any kind of external grant, that part of what Queen's will do to acknowledge their research contribution to Queen's is give them a half course reduction once, but with no reduction in salary. So it's a little break, and it's a little acknowledgement that our continuing adjuncts are very often making big research contributions, and they're doing it without getting paid and without any acknowledgement. So this is a foot in the door piece of language that the employer is acknowledging that continuing adjuncts do research. And then normative terms, I think we're going to look at opening about 6 or 8 articles in the collective agreement, and you can see exactly what we signed. So both the memoranda of agreement that we signed that we're asking you to ratify are right up there in the bargaining page, whole as bullet, like there's nothing left out. You can go read it for yourself. But what we've done with some of these other articles is we've said, over the course of the last collective agreement, 2015 to 19, we've experienced difficulties in some of these articles. They've caused, we call it like burrs under the saddle or a pebble in the shoe. There's parts of the articles that aren't working well. So what we did was we agreed in principle what needs to happen, and that we will now work on the language. If this is ratified, if this MOA is ratified, we'll work on the language either through the Joint Committee to administer the agreement or through, in some cases, working groups or side tables. So that you're not actually voting on linguistic changes to the collective agreement, you're voting on principles to fix things that are broken. So I'm going to also talk a little bit about ratification and consent and where to find information, and then it's really a free-for-all, any questions that you have. So we're going to be asking you to vote on this electronically from February 9th to 15th. You will receive a ballot, an invitation to vote from us, and you will be directed at the time to one of 2 kinds of questions. If you are currently contributing to the pension, so you're not taking it, or you're not in some way prohibited from being a part of the pension, if you're currently actively making contributions and you're a member of the bargaining unit, you're going to receive a combined question that will say, do you consent to convert the pension, and do you agree to the new terms of the collective agreement? You only get to say yes or no to the whole question. You can't say yes to one part and no to the other. And that's because we signed these agreements as tied agreements. We didn't we use the leverage of the pension to get those across-the-board increases. So the university said, fair enough, but you don't get those unless you give us consent. So that's why we're tying those questions for people still contributing to the pension. If you're not contributing to the pension for whatever reason, either you're taking it or you're not a member of the pension plan, you'll get a standard ratification vote question. Do you agree to the terms of the renewed terms of the collective agreement? And I do want to emphasize that you can read the actual memoranda for yourself. They're not that long and complicated, but just so that you know what you're voting on. So this ratification vote, both questions will be sent out to the 2 groups of people at the same time. Everybody's got 6 days to vote. It's electronic. You can vote around the clock. How you vote, 50% plus 1, is going to determine our answer to Queen's with regard to consent to convert the pension. So if you say 50% plus 1 of you say yes, and we'll be looking at the whole vote, then the whole thing is a yes. Yes to the collective agreement, yes to the new pension. If you say no, then the UPP will at least not likely be well, let me get to no in a minute. if you say no to the collective agreement and the UPP, in the first instance, all the terms of the collective agreement will not exist. The renewed collective agreement will not exist. We will go back to having to establish a bargaining team and begin to bargain new terms for a collective agreement ending April 2019. So that's what will happen on the bargaining side. On the UPP side, it's interesting. All of those nice offsets that we negotiated that Rob talked about are contingent in the first instance to QUFA members saying yes to convert the pension. And in the second instance, on an actually new pension being created, right? So you can't have an offset for a higher contribution to a pension you're not making a higher contribution to. So there's kind of two stages there. One of the terrible things that might happen is QUFA members might say no to consent to convert the pension, but everyone else on campus might say yes, and they would have enough to move the pension plan to the new design. So QUFA members represent about 21% of the members of the Queen's Pension Plan. The university needs to get consent to change the pension from 67% of its members. So you can see we nowhere near have a controlling vote in that respect. So one of the most terrible outcomes might be that QUFA says no, everybody else says yes, we don't get any offsets, we don't get any early unreduced, we get no phased, nothing, and yet we get a new pension plan. So for that reason, among many others, we're really hopeful that QUFA members will give us a yes vote in February. Now, in terms of what else you can do to inform yourself, we've created tons and tons of pension news or pension info sheets. They're on their own tab on the pension page of our website. And one of the ones that's there, just back to the question on summary of changes, not only do we have the legalistic, actual, term by term comparison, but Paul Young, who helped negotiate the UPP, also prepared a sort of higher order comparison of changes. And that's also on the QUFA pension page. So the last thing I want to make a pitch for, so please do skate around our website, and every week I'm sending you an email and pointing out things and attaching things. You're also going to receive, hopefully by the end of the week, a hard paper mail out that's going to include a letter from Kyle Lake, who's president of QUFA, and he's here today, along with a couple of our more important pension news bulletins that we think will really draw your attention to key features of the new plan and why we're advocating the yes vote. And my last pitch will just be that Monday at this time, 3 p.m., we're having Cam Hunter come to talk to you. He's an actuary from Eckler's. He has worked very closely on the design of the UPP. He's our kind of technical expert, if you will, and we're having him come to do another town hall, hopefully well populated, hopefully the snow cooperates. We'll also webcast it if you would just refuse to trudge through any more snow in Kingston, which is kind of where people are getting to. We will also webcast it. We'll have the live questions. But I really strongly advise that you take some time on Monday, if you can, to tune in. If you can't, it will be posted the day after. So we are recording these and we're posting them the day after. But it's your chance to talk to someone other than us about why this is a good decision and what it means for you. So I think I'll just stop there. The slide deck also has steps for more information. One of the things Rob often advises people, and I think it's a very good piece of advice, is if you've got a complicated pension or retirement situation, and or if you just don't really understand what all these options and levers might mean for you, Bob Weisnagel in the Queen's Pension Office is available to you to help think about your situation. So he has access to your data. He can plug things into his magic Weisnagel computer and tell you things about, well, if this is the kind of retirement you want, here are the kinds of decisions you want to be thinking about making now. So, if all of this is just a mystery to you and you just need someone to sit in front of you and explain things, well, we imagine Bob is probably going to quit after this ratification vote because we've been sending hundreds of QUFA people to him. He is available and he's a great guy and he has the capacity to make pension information sound like common English. So please do go and see him if you need something, a little bit more directed to your specific concerns. And with that, if there are more questions, we're both available, happy to answer them. No, nothing from our members at home. Anybody here want to ask a question?
Thank you for talking to 5 of us.
Oh, it's our pleasure. We are also still, just in case anyone's out there who we haven't pestered in their unit meetings, we are also doing a roadshow. We're coming to your unit. So if you are not sure if we're visiting your unit or you would like to schedule, you know for certain we're not, just email QUFA@ or ep43@queensu.ca and we can set you up with that. So you can hear all of this again up close. Okay. And if there are no more questions, thank you so much for braving the snow. You made this so much easier than talking to Kyle, who's heard it about 150 times. So yay you. Thanks very much.